Good afternoon and namaskar, everyone. Thank you very much, Stephanie. I hope I can live up to that excellent introduction. And thanks, of course, to you and all of the DCF and Sakal team for putting on this magnificent event. So, what I'd like to talk about today, one of my favorite topics, is how we take good ideas and scale them. And we live in a particularly interesting juncture for those of us travelling this journey to deliver change. We've talked a little bit about globalisation, and certainly the globalisation of information and communication. One of the results of this is that the demand for better health services, infrastructure, housing, schooling, it's increasing. It's increasing in parts of the world where perhaps the demand wasn't there before, as the awareness wasn't there before. It's also, unfortunately, happening at a time of declining commodities prices, declining oil prices, slowing in the growth of national GDP. So how do we square this circle? What we have at the moment, this is taken from the Sustainable Development Goals. Approximately $4 trillion of investment is needed each year in order to achieve these Sustainable Development Goals. We have 1.4 trillion roughly committed and a huge gap of 2.5 trillion outstanding, the need gap. On the other hand, there's $210 trillion available in private markets. How do we mobilise some of those funds into the sorts of financing which can enable us to deliver change and deliver positive and enduring social impact? There's a number of ways. I'm going to quickly go through each of them and then focus in on some very interesting work that we're doing here in India, scaling up on work that we've been working on over the past 15 years, but in a very different modality. So some of the financing options include conditional cash transfers, the use of actual cash or vouchers. For example, if bottom of the pyramid mother was to access family planning services, either through a voucher scheme or a cash transfer scheme, she may be given a certain amount to encourage her to have modern contraceptives used. Public-private partnerships where private investors and companies cost share the risk of things like infrastructure, particularly, but more and more in the social sector as well. And they take the risk of putting the upfront capital and then through fees over the course of the lifetime of the infrastructure particularly, they recoup those gains. Market systems development. Well, Palladium does a huge amount of work in market systems development across sub-Saharan Africa, through South Asia and into Southeast Asia and indeed the South Pacific as well. This is about stimulating value chains, usually in the agriculture sector, to build up enterprise within those value chains, access to market linkages, ensuring the inputs, the supply is steady, technical assistance. External investment facilitation, Jose Maria's discussion around cocoa and chocolate, very important to us all. So we are in Peru facilitating private investment into that cocoa value chain, in Guyana, into fish markets, Macedonia, dairy markets, bringing in private investors, private companies to be able to support that growth. We're also in the business of building platforms for donors and foundations so that they can invest their funds to ensure returnable capital, which also has that double bottom line of positive impact. For the Department for International Development in the UK, for the Asian Development Bank, Farm Access. So this is using our expertise and others' expertise in this field to be able to harness the huge sums of committed donor commitments to be able to achieve this sustainable enterprise-based return to achieve positive social impact. We also work with governments and business partnership platforms to co-invest funds of donors and governments with private companies throughout the South Pacific and Southeast Asia. And one of my favorites, of course, is blended finance, really bringing in public capital to work with private capital in the private markets. So the public capital and foundation and philanthropic capital is used as catalytic funds to de-risk the private capital. And quite unusually for a company like ourselves, we're also involved in impact investment ourselves, so committing our own funds, risking our own funds to be able to invest in private enterprises, largely in opportunities which have come to us through the market systems development work that we do. And the other area that I'm going to deep dive into is impact bonds. So most of these, of course, use private capital, and this is necessary. That's the $210 trillion that I was referring to. Really important, as I think the zeitgeist is changing. Millennials, certainly, we've used that term a lot during the course of the last day and a half. But it's not just millennials, it is corporates as well. It is the more mainstream investors, the Goldman Sachs, the JP Morgans, the ABN AMROs, who are looking for a pipeline of opportunities. They have funds and their clients are very explicitly saying, we want to double, if not a triple, bottom line, social and environmental. So social impact bonds I'm going to particularly talk about. It's essentially a combination of impact investing and payment by results. They're also known as social bonds, social benefit bonds, pay for success bonds, social yield bonds, and development impact bonds. With all of this talk of bonds, you'd be forgiven for thinking that they were in fact a bond. They're not. In fact, they're more like a public-private partnership, a contract using a structured financial instrument to facilitate performance-based contracts aimed at delivering a social or development outcome. And because I think we are all a big fan of acronyms, we would have to use, let's just use impact bonds, shall we? So, in very simple terms, what is an impact bond? Well, the first step of an impact bond is you have to identify a social challenge that someone is willing to pay to have resolved. These are particularly useful in preventative measures. So, as soon as you've identified your social challenge, you need to agree on a set of targets and associated payment metrics. You then have investors who want to take the risk of achieving this social outcome. They provide the risk capital, and they only receive the return, that is to say not just the capital, but also a success premium, let's call it a success premium, if those targets are achieved. So what this does is it gives flexibility. A lot of development programs have inputs-based contracts. So a government says to a service delivery organization, we'd like you to build an urban community which provides employment and health opportunities to its 100,000 people. Here is the money and go ahead and we hope you do it. And usually speaking, the houses are built, but the higher level impact of that work, the economic opportunities, the health services, the community engagement, that's really just hoped for. What this mechanism does is say that if the results aren't met, if the targets aren't met, then that risk capital is lost. So the investors, they take that risk capital, they provide it to the service providers implement the funds, and it's only if those outcomes are met that the outcome payers, governments or donors or indeed corporations, repay the funds to the investors. It's a closed system to a certain extent, so that the investors and the service providers, their contractual relationship is very tight, but within that, They're able to innovate, they're able to be flexible, and they're able to really release the entrepreneurial spirit and provide those value-adding solutions. It drives efficiency, it focuses entirely on results, and it shifts the risk from the public purse to the private purse, so that governments don't pay for failures. It also, of course, addresses the need for public budgetary constraints, and while Aitan said yesterday that his fund is not finding too much difficulty with a pipeline of products globally, this is one of the issues that impact investors have. They are simply unable to find sufficient pipeline to invest in. So some of that $210 trillion remains unspent as a result. The work that one of my colleagues, I hope some of you have had the opportunity to meet him, Dr. Amit Banot, has been implementing over the last 3 years, and previously, that's in Orissa and Bihar, previously in Uttar Pradesh. We've been implementing a very successful program, most recently in Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, Bihar and Orissa, with UK aid money. That's the Department for International Development of the United Kingdom. Now, India has its own space program. It's a donor in its own right. Many of the traditional donors are moving out of India. And yet this program, which expanded the choice of delivery services through the private sector, improved the availability of products in that last mile, built up an ecosystem of female entrepreneurs, increased the demand for quality health services, and built in a culture of monitoring and evaluation. That program, which had these phenomenal results, was no longer being funded. I won't read them all, but 1,455 mothers' lives saved, 200,000 unsafe abortions averted, savings to the health system of £50 million, 50 crore rupee, I think. Thank you. Thank you. I mean, incredible. So how do we take this successful program and use private risk capital to be able to scale it? Well, Amit and I spent many hours discussing this, and development impact bonds, let me tell you before I seem like a poster child for these mechanisms, they're very new. They're quite untested. But this seemed to us to be an excellent opportunity to really, really work on what could be a totally transformative mechanism, unlocking untold volumes of private capital in order to achieve positive impact. Very quickly, Rajasthan, 60 million people by area, one of the largest, if not the largest states in India, 33 districts, very high population growth, a very high total fertility rate, 2.9 versus a target of 2.1. These figures slightly outdated. The 2012-13 SRS, 255 deaths per 100,000 births for the maternal mortality rate. That's lower now in the latest unpublished figures, but still much higher than the rest of India. NMR, again, higher by quite a significant amount compared to the average in India. And this despite the fact that the results of programs like RSBY and JSY have increased the number of births in facilities dramatically. What it hasn't done, what these programs haven't done, is have a consequently dramatic reduction on maternal and neonatal mortality. So here's the figures in terms of comparison, 255 versus 178 and 40 versus 47. It's obviously a state which needs to have more of a boost. And it has quite a large and vibrant private sector. 40% of institutional deliveries are done in private facilities. So what we're talking about here in terms of the total births per annum of 1.8 million, a minimum of 305,000 of those being delivered in private facilities. So very substantial indeed. Government of Rajasthan, and particularly the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare and the National Health Mission, very forward-leaning. They enacted PPP legislation in 2015 to encourage private investment and private players into the health sector in Rajasthan, and have been a great partner in the development of this impact bond, which has certainly not been an easy task, as you'll see when I get to the number of actors involved in this, all with their own objectives. The programmatic design is going to work with private facilities throughout all of the districts in Rajasthan to bring them up to a certain quality standard. It's a new certification. It's a joint quality certification put together by the National Accreditation Board for Hospitals and Small Healthcare Organisations, NABH, in partnership with the Federation of Obstetrics and Gynecological Societies of India, or FOGSI. And so we're going to be working with a minimum of 360 of these facilities, or engaging a higher number because of dropouts. But we'll be targeting to get at least 360 of these private facilities up to this quality level, which will enable these facilities to provide sustainable quality maternity services through this, and also enable them to access some of the demand-side financing to increase the demand, and have, if you like, what we're presuming to be something of a critical mass, a tipping point. So of the 1,700 private facilities in Rajasthan, 80% of which provide delivery services, we're looking to target at least 40% of those across the state, and with that, bring a sense of, for those facilities who aren't engaged, seeing, well, they're getting more footfall because they're providing higher quality services, we'd better do that as well. So this is the theory of change behind the work that we're doing. This accreditation process, it has 260 elements to it. The NABH is very much process and infrastructure oriented. The FOGSI accreditation is more behavioural for clinical practice. It's quite challenging. We did a rapid assessment in July and August of last year, and we found one facility in our sample of 10 districts which would meet the FOGSI standard, and not a single one which would meet the NABH standard. So we've got a really long way to go in order to make this work, but it's the only way that we're going to be assured of actually having that higher level impact on the maternal and neonatal mortality rates. This essentially encapsulates it in simple form. You have your universe of private facilities. The program focuses on getting them up to the standard of this Matritva maternity certification. This will, drive increased demand through the accredited facilities and increase maternal and newborn facilities. So, as I mentioned at the start, the funds will only be paid out if the outcomes are achieved. In this case, we're using a rate card approach. It'll be $18,000 per facility, which reaches this quality standard. Of course, we've done all of the economic analysis that is comparable with global costs for this type of activity, very good value for money in terms of the impact on life saved and disability adjusted life years, and we're able, of course, to substantiate it with the existing data. So this is the real life example. What we have is the government of Rajasthan. My apologies that the icons are a little small here. The government of Rajasthan, the US government through the US Agency for International Development, and Merck for Mothers. In India, they're known as MSD for Mothers. That's the 10-year, $500 million commitment to saving mothers' lives from MSD. They have decided to pay for these outcomes. Now, normally, what should happen is that those commissioners of these outcomes identify the social challenge themselves and build up this ecosystem and request for innovative mechanisms to be able to address it themselves. However, in this case, given our experience in Orissa and Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, in fact, we came to them with the idea and gained their endorsement, at which point they said, great, bring on the others. So we needed then to find the investors. In this case, Swiss bank UBS, they have a foundation as well, the UBS Optimus Foundation. They're putting up the risk capital. The next slide shows the figures, but essentially what we're talking about is $9 million. It's the first of its type in the world, certainly the largest by far of any impact bond globally. UBS will provide us with the upfront capital to deliver the services. We will provide our service provider partners with the operational funds to be able to work with the Rajasthani population through the private sector. Now, we obviously, of course, need to have an arm's length relationship with the verification of those results. So that independent verification undertaken by a third party, they then say to the outcome funders, yes, what they've said has been achieved, and the funds are then released. There's a couple of interesting things which is super innovative in this particular innovative financing mechanism. Firstly, Palladium and HLFPPT and PSI, the implementation team, we are co-investors in this program. If we fail, we lose our money. We have skin in the game for this. This, I think, is important in order to align incentives, but it hadn't been done previously. So this was one of the pieces that we were able to work with the service providers particularly, who this was quite outside of their realm of experience, to convince them and all of the other actors in this group that that was a good idea. The second element of this, which is particularly cool, if I say so myself, is that the government of Rajasthan will become a commissioner of the outcomes in years 4 and 5. So I said in that one slide you have all these different terms: social bonds, social yield bonds, social impact bonds, development impact bonds. Generally speaking, development impact bonds are if a third party is commissioning the outcomes. So in this case, the example is the Merck for Mothers and USAID. And a social impact bond is seen as when the host government, the public sector in the host government, is going to pay for those outcomes themselves. So this particular design transitions from a development impact bond through to a social impact bond, which is a key strategy for the sustainability of this particular piece of work. Once those independent verification agencies have verified the outcomes, the payment is provided on the achievement of those targets, and we pay the initial capital and the premium on the achievement of those agreed targets. What that looks like is something like this. Below low, in fact, it's negative, so there's no capital preservation guarantee in this. We as investors can lose our capital. If we just sort of slide by, and I think we get something like 314 facilities up to this quality standard, we'll get 0. That's worth thinking about. So we've improved the quality of 314 private facilities. So looking there at just there, something around the order of 65,000, 70,000 births being affected per annum. Even if we do that, all we get is capital preservation back. So what it cost. If we achieve those targets that we're thinking are rather ambitious, the medium level, there's a 10% return. And if we really blow it out of the park and get 450 facilities up to that standard, there'll be a 15% return. There's a number of nuances in this. UBS, in fact, is not going to take any of this money. First of all, they're capping their own return at 8%. Second of all, they're actually going to, and they're using their clients' funds, but they've agreed with those clients that they will put the return into a revolving fund. So it's not lining the bank of wealthy Swiss investors. It is indeed going to be able to roll out more activities, certainly within the maternal and newborn health space, and hopefully, if we can demonstrate the efficacy and the efficiency of this, into more impact bonds. I wanted to, I think, also just go back to this slide, and this is important for India. You'll see, particularly in the outcome funders, you've got donors, you've got governments, you've also got companies. Now, we all know the 2013 Act, we all know the 2%, we all know that it's not being particularly well spent in all cases. You can see a really powerful argument here for using that CSR commitment of that 2% to be outcome funds. What this would mean is that these companies, which may not have the capacity nor the inclination to set up a whole CSR unit in and of themselves, they'll be able to put this into a fund, so those CSR funds will be committed, and if and only if the agreed targets are met, will those funds be dispersed. So instead of a scattergun approach of CSR, or essentially donations, shall we say, we would have a CSR ecosystem where those funds are guaranteed to be impactful. If they're not impactful, they're rolled into the fund back up again and being able to be used for, you have to agree to the thematic focus, so it would have to be used on maternal and newborn health programs in the future. But I think this is an area that we really need to explore. Certainly with the government of Rajasthan, what they're looking at is a combination in the second phase, in years 4 and 5, of their own funds, as well as philanthropic funds, which they will manage. It's an interesting model. This keeps on going back to 2, so I presume I can keep on talking until everyone gets bored, but I will finish this shortly. I guess what we're talking about here, these are my contact details. I really wanted everyone to have my contact details because I'd like everyone to think about opportunities which could be turned into impact bonds, could be turned into impact investments, could be turned into results-based financing initiatives. And why don't we start up a community of practice around this in our WhatsApp group or something more formal? I think, India has the resources, the intellectual capital, the entrepreneurial spirit to deliver this sort of innovative change more than any other country I've worked in, and I've worked in a lot. So I really am very hopeful that this type of structure, this type of mechanism, which doesn't just encourage the private sector to work with the public sector. Often that's quite fraught. There are different languages that is spoken in these two worlds. This sort of mechanism necessitates a common platform and a common language and a common set of targets. So it breaks down those barriers. It necessitates collaboration in a way that perhaps we haven't seen before. So, on that note, thank you very much.